Habitat Center, we welcome you this evening to the Charles Correa Memorial Lecture. The Raza Foundation, in collaboration with the India Habitat Center, organizes as many as 9 annual memorial lectures devoted to music, dance, theatre, literature, philosophy, cinema, tribal arts, visual arts, and they are named after some of the masters of our time. Somebody once asked me, why have you chosen these 9 rather than some other 9? So I said, well, I have been lucky enough and old enough, 85 and a half now, to have been in the shadow of many masters. So I have chosen my favorite ones. Charles Correa, as you know, I had a personal relationship with him. He did our multi-art center in Bhopal, Bharat Bhavan. And since then, we became friends. He used to call it a non-building because he has built a complex with 1 lakh square feet area, built area, but you could never see it fully from anywhere. It was done in such a way that it was not visible. So he used to call it non-building. And I was a building grabber. I was trying to do something in the arts, and Bharat Bhavan at that time had come up as a concept, and we created a Department of Culture, and I became a Secretary of Culture, and I made Swaminathan and B.V. Karan to come there. And the building, as originally envisaged, underwent several changes when Charles started interacting with Swaminathan and Karan, etc. Well, thank you for making this house full. It keeps, frankly, houseful doesn't keep us going. But a good house surely assures us that we are doing something worthwhile. Rahul Mehrotra is an architect, urbanist, and educator who is the founder principal of RMA Architects and professor of urban design and planning at the Department of Urban Planning and Design at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. What a long something, no? Yeah. He has designed projects that range from recycling urban land and master planning in Mumbai to the design of art spaces, boutiques, weekend houses, factories, social institutes, and office buildings across India, thereby engaging diverse issues, multiple constituencies, and varying scales, from interior design and architecture to urban design, conservation, and planning. So you're going to listen to someone who has such a wide range of interests and professional stakes. He studied at the School of Architecture, Ahmedabad, graduated with a master's degree in urban design, and with distinction from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. Apart from his engagement with the design of buildings, Mehrotra has been actively involved in civic and urban affairs in Mumbai, having served on commissions for historic preservation and environmental issues with various neighboring groups. He was the executive director of the Urban Design and Research Institute, where he is now a trustee, as has taught at the University of Michigan and the School of Architecture and urban planning at MIT. So ladies and gentlemen, you are going to listen to someone who has such wide interest, rich expertise, and I'm sure very delightful and inspiring eloquence. So there you are.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you, Ashokji, and thank you for this invitation. Really an honor to be invited by you and the Raza Foundation to deliver this third Charles Correa Memorial Lecture. This is a bit of a long lecture, so excuse me if I race through it, but it's very interesting because when I talked to Ashokji about the lecture, he said, you know, it should be more than projects, and I'm so glad he said that because I just find it absolutely boring to show projects, and he encouraged me to share research and thinking, which I think resonated because I really believe that architects have to be part of a much broader conversation about the world around them, rather than become people who can just materialize things that are thrown at them, which is unfortunately, because with that we develop a kind of myopia, which is just not healthy, I believe, for the environment. So what I'm going to do is, for this lecture, it's about three big chunks of sections. One is I'm going to pay a 5-minute tribute to Charles. The second is I'm going to share with you how I feel research and why it means practice, because I do believe research is a form of practice. And the third is I'm going to very quickly share with you a sampling of the kind of research projects which I believe has helped me actually inform my own practice. I think the second part of this series could be practice as research, right? So because from practice also, the whole idea is about how we can create these feedback loops which allow us to, in a reiterative form, be informed and nourished by what we see around us. I met Charles for the first time in the mid-80s. In the decades before that, as a student of architecture, I followed and was, can we cut the lights out so you can see the slides maybe? But in the decades before that, as a student of architecture, I followed and was inspired by his writings and of course reading about his buildings in magazines like India Today. I remember Bharat Bhavan was first featured in India Today because we didn't have a culture of journals. And one of the earliest pieces by Correa I came across was an essay that he wrote in the early 1960s for Architecture Review, which is a London-based publication, where he wrote a critique of Chandigarh, both its buildings as well as its urbanism. So for a young architect, I think I was all of 19 at that time, it was a time when the profession was groveling at the feet of Corbusier, but Charles at that time both incisively celebrated as well as critically looked at the flaws inherent in the imagination of Chandigarh. For me, reading this essay as a 19-year-old student of architecture introduced me to the idea of honest criticism, but also the idea that then the profession, for its own good, had to be self-reflexive. And I think that's something that I feel lacking within the profession even today. So today I'll just share with you my own trajectory of how one has engaged with that. And so, these were the kinds of books one came across, Charles's collective writings. He wrote a lot in Seminar magazine, which was a forum where he could say things that were political, which just went under the radar, so to speak, and revisiting some, such as an essay he did called Consciousness 2, is highly political in terms of what he was trying to get across. This is that essay I was referring to. This was the essay in Architectural Review where he wrote about Corbusier. He said he flies through the air with the greatest of ease, that daring old man on the flying trapeze. That was sort of the entrance, but it was a very honest criticism, and I personally believe he came into notice, because he was in his 30s when he wrote that, so he came into notice within the larger foreign architectural press, because it was a rare thing for criticism on Corbusier coming out of India at that moment. And so that was very inspirational. And then of course the planning for New Bombay, Marg magazine, that famous issue which led to the creation of a whole city. But then Vistara, which was, I think, a very important moment, I believe, because this exhibition titled Vistara, which was international, held between 83 and 86, presented a narrative of India's architectural traditions. It highlighted how urban and folk paradigms had been seamlessly integrated in the architecture of India through the ages. It made the range of architectural production in India from the vernacular to the monumental appear seamless, interconnected by the idea that architecture was myth-based, expressing the presence of a reality more profound than the manifest world in which it exists. This exhibition inadvertently challenged the architect to move and embrace more divergent directions in such a way that the past and the present could be configured to construct the future. More importantly, it also implicitly shifted the gaze from the industrial as modernism and modern India to the village and rural and ancient India as the site of intellectual nourishment for architects and architectural identity production. And so I think this was, and I believe it was his response to postmodernism, which in the United States and Europe had become very facile. It had become surface decoration. So I think he was struggling to find that with our depth of an ancient tradition, how could we move beyond modernism to construct new meanings and imaginaries. And then, of course, the new landscape and housing and urbanization, which led also simultaneously to the report of the National Commission on Urbanization, which was really the first stock taking of the urban condition in India. And I think it was really seminal, and one reads it even today and it resonates. And I'll show you some research we are doing, and I can't believe when I look at it that he had already had those insights, which now our data is sort of showing us. And so therefore on Ashokji's sort of insistence, I made this research as practice because I thought I could, as a tribute to Charles, use that kind of insight and spectrum to see and reflect on what one was also doing. So as an urban designer, for me, I think I carry that identity, Katie. I hope you agree. That blur between the practice of architecture and planning is a given. So therefore, one doesn't see a binary condition. And to work across the spectrum of understanding context of one's interventions has been very critical, at least in my own practice. Furthermore, I believe in complex projects, especially for urban design, the public realm or the scale of the city and the actors really become differentiated, and hence the building of constituencies, like a politician does, becomes a crucial moment to engage different stakeholders in a project. And this is often done through various media to put across ideas, and it is here that I believe research as practice, writing, communicating ideas of the city become very important and integral to an architectural practice. And the moment we detach from that process, we actually lose agency, because then we are not part of the broader conversation. And I think this is something that was very inspirational from Charles and his practice, because he was central to all those conversations. And so the question is, some of them become scholarly, some of them are not. So it's the whole spectrum. And I think in retrospect, for me, more than anything, the research and publications becomes a way of creating partnerships, collaborations, friendships. And it keeps the conversations alive so that we can really engage. But I think most importantly, and I'll come at the end to this, it allowed us to expand our sphere of influence, because our spheres of concern for all of us as citizens and architects especially is expanding exponentially, but our sphere of influence is actually diminishing in the same rate. And so therefore I believe research and creating conversations and articulating the conditions that surround us is a way that we can calibrate a balance between the two. And so therefore, when you look at a diagram like this, to imagine there are more people in that circle than outside, but the theories we allude to come from all outside. And so therefore, what does even theory mean? How do we even understand the profession? And so therefore, as architects, we look at context. We understand context as a physical thing, climate, materials. Some of us are more ambitious and we excavate the site to look at embedded histories. But actually, we have to be even more ambitious, and we have to nestle the context in its context. And by that nestling, I think we begin to create much more interesting intersections which begin to open up other ways of looking at the world. And I think it will give us more nuanced, productive readings for our sites of interventions, meta-narratives in a sense that clarify what the context of the context is. And that instrument, I believe, can help us imagine precise range of potential interventions. So one such family of narratives that can fundamentally challenge our forms of engagement as designers is that of the contemporary rapid geo-economic integration and even uneven spatial development. Inequity, clearly, we will all agree, will be the greatest and biggest issue that we are going to face over the decades. So for evidence of this, one need not even look further than the shifting demographies at the national and global scales. Look at all the migration, displacement, refuge, climate migration. And so I think from that kind of understanding, you will get the remaking of political identities, you'll understand the urbanization of poverty, new claims on citizenship, and we have to be able to also participate in those conversations. Otherwise, architecture really has no agency. And this squarely leads us to narratives such as state reconstruction under neoliberalism, the notion of simultaneous transitions in cities. This is something my colleague Eve Blau, who's a specialist on East Europe, talks about. She says transitions, like in East Europe, and I think India is the same, they don't happen overnight. You know, India is yet transitioning out of socialism and yet transitioning into capitalism, some form of it, simultaneously. And the muddle we see in the environment is because there's a simultaneous transition occurring. And that goes on for decades. It doesn't happen overnight because systems have to dissolve into new systems. Cultures have to change. And so I think understanding all of this as architects will help us and inform our interventions in, I think, much more robust ways. And so, therefore, then what is theory? Theory is really a moral compass. It's reflecting on what one sees on the ground, making frameworks that one can then discern, that can guide us. And theory, like identity, has to be dynamic. The idea that we think identity is a found thing is a misnomer. And that's why, you know, when we get into facile discussions about Indian identity, it's really non-productive. Identity is what we construct through a common set of values. And therefore, even theory is something we have to continuously reflect on and construct. It's not, and we get dogmatic about this. We study theory and then try applying it to understand the world, and the world has changed. And so all of these categories really need to be interrogated. I bring up, and I might actually classify what I'm going to show you as research, as really propositional research. Urban design, which is the central focus of my own research, is a practice, and one would argue is not a discipline. It's a practice, it's not a discipline. A discipline needs theoretical frameworks that are much broader and robust. There's a culture of those disciplinary theories. Urban design is much more of a practice because urban design inherently is about activism. I believe it is about creating a bridge between the site specificity of architecture and the myopia that architecture brings and the complete abstraction of planning, which has become policy documents. And therefore it is about reiterative feedback loops and therefore inherently about advocacy. And propositional research as a category becomes incredibly important. This research really aims, I would say, let me just say, so the propositional research refers to a research approach where the primary focus is on formulating and exploring propositions, which are statements that suggest a potential relationship between concepts, often used in fields that suggest a potential, it's used in fields where empirical testing might be difficult. And in many cases, in what we do in urban design, empirical testing is always not possible, correct? Therefore, what it does is it uses observations that are propositional in nature to serve as a starting point for further investigation and theory development. Essentially, it involves exploring theoretical connections between ideas rather than immediately testing specific hypotheses with concrete data. So it's quite different. And I think within the fields of architecture as well as urban design, we need to develop a framework and a culture. And so what the research aims to focus on is exploring the logical connections between abstract concepts where there is a limited existing knowledge on a topic, and researchers might use propositions to identify potential relationships to guide further research. And so there are many, many examples of this. Much has been written about this, and for me, this as a category and a formulation really resonates. The popular example of proposition research is the quote, increased employment autonomy leads to higher job satisfaction. You can't make that through empirical data. And so how do we bring this kind of culture and intuition, in a sense, too? So for example, I think the questions for the urban designers in the room and the architects that Kevin Lynch or Gordon Cullen posed about how cities are perceived is a form of propositional research, right? Perceptions. I mean, they were trying to make it empirical and quantified, but it was never really successful. So it's where they're in areas where there are variables and it's difficult to measure or manipulate, propositions can be used to explore theoretical connections between concepts. So with that, I'm going to actually begin to start sharing some research with you, and I'll go through a series of research. These are samples, it's not all of it, it's not conservation, many things we've done, but I'll try to run you through this, so it'll be a bit of a roller coaster. So one of the things that, as a result of this, I've been interested in is how can we design for transitions and not for absolute solutions? And the provocation I put to the audience is, are we making permanent solutions offer for temporary problems? When I drive around a city like Delhi or Mumbai, which is now filled with what the anthropologist Arjun Appadurai calls the weapons of mass construction, you wonder, why is this going to be is it permanent? Are we designing permanent solutions for temporary problems? And I think that is a very important question that we should be as citizens looking at, right? And of course we can get into the discussions of the politics of that later. And so the idea of flux is something we have to accept, and as designers we premise our understanding of the world and aspiration on the notion of permanence. And I'm not saying permanence is not important. I will end the lecture by saying why permanence is important, but I think, can we understand flux? And therefore, how do you design for flux? How do you design transitions rather than imagining what might be absolute, right? And when flux hits the ground, that's what you get. You get the intersection of the weapons of mass construction with the lack of accommodation of habitation, natural systems which get displaced. And this is an image that's emblematic, in my view, of urban India, maybe exaggerated. And so the first piece of research I want to share with you is something we've been working on, is asking the question, what is urban, even, right? The fundamental. And this is research based on the last census. I'm hoping this census is delayed because this book is overdue. And so hopefully we'll have it out soon. But I believe our findings here, and I'm going to share with you only 1% of it, will actually be reinforced. Because what really, I mean, if you look at the night lights, it's quite different from the government's representation. And we talk about propositional research, proxies like this are very important. And this was a proxy for me to start this research 10 years ago, where with students, what we essentially simply did was to spatialize the census data and see what comes out of it. And therefore, what does that mean for architects? And I'll share some insights. So this is how the government represents urbanization, big circles, small circles, which will give you, based on 3 criteria, a population over 5,000 people, density of 400 people per square kilometer, 75% of the male population should be in non-agricultural employment. If a settlement meets these 3 criteria, it's urban, it gets a municipality, and the rest get left out of it. Now in India, there are places that are 150,000 people that are yet run by a panchayat because they don't meet the criteria. 75% of the male population with the flux I talked about, that's not even believable today. So the criteria is extremely outdated, which is giving us a reading of urban India such as this. So what we did was took the spatial data and a very fine at the village level, district and village level, we basically started seeing what those spatial patterns are, and we took every criteria. So when we took the criteria of 5,000 people, that first slide is what urban India is. You see a kind of distribution. There are many settlements over 5,000. If you took the criteria of 400 people per square kilometer, the world's biggest mega city goes all the way from Kashmir to Calcutta, and it's about 100 or 200 miles wide. It has about 400 million people living there. It's the Indo-Gangetic Plain, which is also going to be the most susceptible to climate change. So that's an urban time bomb we are sitting on. 400 people per square, Greater Houston, it's a figure I just have in the top of mind, is 240 people per square kilometer. So this is a very high density, and it's mind-blowing when you see that. And of course, Kerala will be consistent here because that is an even spread. So if you take the criteria of 75% of the male population in non-agricultural uses, that whole megacity disappears because everyone in the Indo-Gangetic Plain is doing other things besides agriculture, and therefore they don't register. And so that's a real contradiction. So what is the criteria that one is actually planning for? And so what we've done in this research has gone down to many nuances, looking at rice harvesting seasons and how the population moves potentially, what is the railway system that serves what villages, wheat harvesting, and we are trying to see propositional research, is that something we can draw from it? One of the things we've come back out with, and you can understand the pandemic-induced reverse mobility. I don't call it reverse migration, which is, I think, a horrible word to use for internal migration. So it was reverse mobility, and you see the Indo-Gangetic Plain, which is where the 400 million people live, because a lot of the workers in our cities come from there. So that is also a clear connection. So one of the many conclusions we are coming, one of the big conclusions we are coming with is there about 13,650, this is the last census, I bet that figure will go up to 20,000, what we are calling transitioning settlements, which are settlements that display all the characteristics of an urban place, but are yet defined as villages. And then they're broken down in those categories. And that's the real urban time bomb. These are people, there's no place there that's more than 2 hours away from employment or a big city, right? In Mumbai, I have people who work in my studio who travel 2 hours and they are considered to be living in Mumbai, right? And these are a whole landscape of 400 million people potentially based on this census who are actually essentially urban, their livelihoods are urban, but they live in rural conditions, which means they don't have municipalities, public health, sanitation, and all of that. And this is the urban time bomb we are sitting on. What are the, and so this is the book, this is the first sort of iteration of the design. It's called Becoming Urban, because I believe India is partially urban for 6 months of the year, largely, I mean 60%, 30%, you can break it up. But there are many, many implications of this, and one of them is sanitation, and the other is housing, and I'll come to that. So this research went into sanitation, and we began to look at the university with students at what sanitation might mean here, and you realize that it's amazing what our GDP loss is just because of the poor sanitation. Now the Swachh Bharat and all of that are great, great efforts to correct this. But this is where I believe we are looking at absolute solutions, right? You have to have 2 million toilets, they're made in a factory, they're put outside someone's hut, and you have a toilet. As we know, research has shown those are used for other things. Look at that red booth and this grandson trying to encourage his grandfather to use that toilet. This is absolute solutions where you're ticking off numbers, etc. So therefore, how, and design hasn't been brought to this. We can think of transitionary solutions. So public toilets is a good way to go to individual toilets, because in a settlement like that, it's impossible. Therefore, then it's linked to housing. How do we solve the housing problem? So it can't be looked at separate domains. Its ecology has to be understood in order to be able to address these questions. So those are, and that's where design, I believe, can play a big role. So this is the kind of research. I do a series called Extreme Urbanism. I've just finished the 10th one. And this one looked at sanitation as infrastructure. Don't look at sanitation as toilets, but it's a form of infrastructure. And then how can it be broadened? It changes the imagination in how you do it. And then what is that ecology within which sanitation can sit? What are the interconnected domains? Therefore, we were calling it not public toilets, but a sanitation hub that can do all the way from public health programs, vaccination. I mean, a community toilet in a slum, let's say, is the best pathology lab possible, because you can test people almost on a daily basis with samples, which means you have an indicator on the public health. And therefore, if one thinks ecologically about this as transitions rather than absolutism, then I think it opens up many design imaginations. And what we did as part of this research, and this is available for public consumption, it's made a manual which defines and designs a sanitation hub in 3 or 4 situations: peri-urban, urban, like near Dharavi, on the perimeter of cities, small towns. And it's a catalog with tender documents that we did, so any NGO can take it and actually build it. And we set a method up, which is we looked at the materials used in that small town. We call it a urban transitioning settlement, and how just from that palette of materials, which would indicate what the skills are there, you could actually actually assimilate and create a hub which is dismantleable, can become a community center in the future as you have public and you have individual sanitation. Similarly, we did that for a high density settlement where you might have to go ground in one, it might have to be steel, it might have to be like scaffolding to be able to accommodate this. But then it becomes a Trojan horse for the public toilet. Otherwise, the public toilet is now becoming the new landmarks in many cities like Mumbai. Because in this kind of landscape, that is the only way you have to think in terms of transitions. And then that leads to the question of housing, which is much broader. So the next research I just want to share is the state of housing, which I did with Ranjit Hoskote and Kaiwan Mehta, which took a temperature on what was the state of housing in India. And this was, of course, a documentation. What you see on these tables are 80 case studies from independence to the present, which show timelines, which show how housing is delivered and how those 80 types actually have informed the larger thinking about housing. And each one of those portfolios that you see there, if you open them, they have a timeline, how much time it took, who was involved, who are the actors, the plans, the sections, the elevations, and axonometric. So it becomes a catalog of housing types, so to speak, in India. And then who are the actors? Again, these are all just details of that one project. And there are 80 such projects that are documented. We also looked at delivery, and what was a very interesting finding is that you see that area of overlap, the gray area, that is the only little chunk in which private and public actually overlap and talk to each other. Otherwise, private enterprise is delivering, public enterprise is delivering, they're not even connected. And we talk about public-private, partnerships and things. And so that kind of those gaps, so to speak, is what this exhibition brought out. And I think the most important critique really for me was the 30 square meter unit, because the state is imagining our housing solutions as 300 square feet. That's what the redevelopment projects for slum dwellers. And if you don't imagine that type appropriately, you're really creating vertical slums. And that is being perpetuated. And I think architects and architecture can play a big role in beginning to reimagine this in a sense. So these are the kinds of exhibitions which begin to open up spaces for us to think about what we are doing perhaps differently. It also brings up, between the urban studies, it also, and this is something that our community has talked a lot about, is we've got fixated on a very narrow metric, right? We discuss housing as 1 BHK, 2 BHK, 3 BHK. It all assumes a nuclear family that has economic mobility and the house can get bigger. But if you have the flux that I was talking about of migrants moving across, you need YMCA type hostels, you need dharamshalas, you need a whole typological difference in terms of how housing can be solved. And the state can play a big role in this. Instead of just doing slum redevelopment, they could be thinking of other typologies, and especially the transitioning settlements where the contestations are minimum, political, land, real estate, that why lock ourselves into the same solutions where we have other options? And I think this is something that emerged for me. This is a very interesting diagram that a colleague of mine, Joan Busquets, made. He's Spanish. And he said that, if any city is made out of urbanization, plot division, and building, the traditional city, you had urbanization. A monarch decided they were going to habit a city. And then the monarch sold the land and plots were divided, whether it's Jaisalmer, whether it's any city we think of. And then buildings were made usually by private enterprise, right? Or sometimes a monarch. In the garden city development, which was industrialization in England, urbanization and plot division got collapsed. That means somebody laid it all out and let you build the individual building. In housing estates, which is what developers do now, it completely collapses where urbanization, plot division, and building is one, and you get a key and you get your apartment. In informal housing, it completely reverses. That is, a building comes first, then a politician might, agree to some plots, and then ratify it, and then you'll have water supply, electricity. So actually, most of our cities are being made completely in reverse to the paradigms and the theories that inform the way as students and architects we enter the world. And therefore, how does one reverse this through pedagogy, etc., becomes critical. Then I think the other issue that comes out of this for me is the coexistence of the temporary and the permanent. I mean, I'm not arguing that the temporary or transitionary solutions are the only thing. It's how we blur this binary. We are seeing the world in the binary of the temporary and the permanent, and that's why we have formal and the informal. We have the state and the private. Design is about creating the third space, which is creating a condition where through space these contestations can be dissolved, ideally, in an ideal world, right? And so the aspiration for permanence and the notion of the permanence of the temporary is also something that we should theorize around. And so if you look at the history of cities, the towns were really conduits for the surplus of the countryside. That is essentially how cities were made. Because from the countryside, markets came temporarily and they set up. This is in the European tradition. I didn't find enough images from India or from South Asia. And this persists through Christmas markets, etc. And so when the merchants began to see a pattern of the surplus from the rural coming to the urban, they built their houses there. And then those houses, they got richer, they built bigger houses. Then they needed amenities. And finally, the culmination of that was the city beautiful in Vienna, right? But Vienna was also where zoning first happened. The rich lived somewhere, the industry was elsewhere, etc. So all those ills came from this process, but it's essentially the towns are only conduits of the surplus of the countryside. Now, of course, in the new economy, that changes. I'm just talking about the origins. And so, how do we blur these binaries that we have set the world? Binaries are fantastic ways to understand the world because it's an easy way to organize ourselves, formal, informal, kacha, pakka, rich, poor, global, local, all of that. But how we create a blurring of these, that the coexistence productively of both these conditions is really the challenge for design. And so this led me to writing about what I call the kinetic city, which is a city that is always in motion. And this is a book called The Kinetic City and Other Essays. And what I found in an image like this, where you see, I think, some buildings you might recognize, that I would argue that in this image, what you think is formal housing, not most, but I would say a lot of people also engage in the informal economy. And what you see as informal housing, many of those people are employed in the formal economy. So actually, images don't mean the same thing as our theories tell us to understand. I had a friend, Mark Angeli, who teaches at the ETH. He did a study in Ethiopia where he took a group of students and they identified an informal settlement, and they spent 10 days. They mapped it down to every detail, photographed it, doors, windows, all of that, and they kept the last 2 days for interviews. Now, if a social anthropologist was doing it, they would have done 8 days of interviews and 2 days of photography. The first interview they did, they found it was actually a government formal settlement. It just looked like an informal settlement. So that aesthetic baggage that we carry actually reinforces the way we imagine the world as binaries. And I think we have to be self-critical of this. And so I define the kinetic city, which is, I believe, the state of Indian urbanism, as something that's elastic. It thrives on incrementalism. It appropriates, reappropriates, de-bases, and it's full of soft thresholds where we transgress each other's spaces very easily, whether it's the poor living on the street, someone vending, some seller coming to your house. This transgression is very beautiful. Of course, I'm maybe romanticizing it. And so we've actually mapped it, and I believe it's linked to the index of security. The guy on the top is the least secure, so therefore he has to run when the cops come. That guy at the bottom, where he's got his little shed between two buildings, has bought his way into the system. He's bribed them, he sells to the cops and all of that. And so there's a logic behind how the city works, right? And I'm mindful of not romanticizing it, but understanding that logic, because that feedback for policy is critical. Otherwise, our policy is premised on imaginary of very much the permanent city, where architecture is the central spectacle of the city. It doesn't take the human being into consideration, and therefore it perpetuates a particular paradigm. One of the things, again, one learns from all of this is, if you think about it, any city that you enjoy, Italy, Portugal, all of that, you're walking around, 90% of any city is housing. if you get the fabric of housing right as typologies, you get a fabric, right? And the church and the museum are foreground buildings. The rest becomes background buildings. What is happening in our cities today is everything wants to be foreground buildings. And so you get a mess everywhere because there is no fabric left in our city because everyone is aspiring to be foreground, and we don't know, we've forgotten how to make fabric. And that has to be background. That's typological thinking, whether it's YMCA type housing, whether it's 1 BHK, but that's where we have to focus our urban design effort. And this is an example I give where these cricket fields, which is this wonderful Indian game that the British invented, as Ashish Nandi said, which becomes venues for weddings in Mumbai. The pitch is sacred, so no one touches it. The wedding wraps around it. The club is shared. And by the morning, it sort of goes. And so I've made a taxonomy, which is the landscapes of transaction, which is all of this instability where places are appropriate, so images are unstable because festivals appropriate spaces and they're completely different, like the Ganesh pandals and things like that, and they're reappropriated for other uses. This is elasticity. And then you have habitation, which becomes more complex, which I've talked a little bit about, and then is spectacle, which is not architecture. Festivals really are the spectacle. And so this research is about challenging the idea of the city as a static and a stable entity. If you begin to get away from that, I think it opens up other imaginations, which we absolutely need to engage with, because otherwise I think we're going down the wrong sort of route. And so what happens in the kinetic city, its architecture is not the spectacle of the city. I call those the landscapes of impatient capital, because capital is trying to realize its value, and the landscapes that minimize friction, like Dubai, Shanghai, become the landscapes of impatient capital. It's very brittle form, whereas our cities are more about this, because here architecture is not the single spectacle of the city. Festivals such as the Ganesh festival, Navratri, Dasera, they become the spectacles, and their presence on the everyday landscape pervades and dominates the popular visual culture of Indian cities. And in the case of the Ganesh festival, immersion becomes a metaphor for the spectacle of the city, because as the clay idol dissolves in the water on the last day, the spectacle comes to a close. There are no permanent or static mechanisms to encode the memory of the city or the spectacle. Here, the memory of the city is an enacted process. It is an ongoing enacted process. It's temporal. A moment, it's a temporal moment as opposed to buildings which codify memory in very static ways. And here the city and its architecture sometimes don't even mean the same thing, because within this notion of the kinetic city as a theoretical or a propositional framework, meanings are not stable. Spaces get consumed, interpreted, and recycled. And the kinetic city actually recycles the images of the static city to make something else. And so this research then extended, because it had to be more robust, and we extended it, and kinetic became ephemeral and city became urbanism, and the idea of flux entered the equation of the questions. And here what we did was we actually began to talk about what does ephemeral urbanism mean. And again, this is not to pose this as an alternative to urbanism, but to say that our debates about cities should be infected with these ideas, because it will be more productive to give us these sorts of transitionary solutions. And so I'm just, so that I can have a sip of water, I'll just show you this video. And it's, I'm sorry I didn't connect the sound, but it gives me a break. Around the world, which these are the snowbirds who come from Canada in the winter. They set up markets, etc. Of course, the Kumbh Mela is a big one, which we'll fast forward to. But they're landscapes of celebration, there's transaction, there's a whole lot of stuff, and I won't spend time on it. But what we did was we really then made a taxonomy, which is a taxonomy, I'm sorry, I'll cut this down. A taxonomy which, because it's not only what we see, we usually say slums, markets, and that's a very narrow understanding. But the taxonomy is a landscape of religion, celebration, transaction, extraction, disaster, military, and refuge. These are what are making our landscapes today. And what we did was we said it was very important that we make these in metrics that would actually be able to speak to architects and planners. So we mapped time durail because the temporal becomes very important. I'm giving you an example like transactions. When we looked at transactions, we actually, did metrics on how many markets exist around the world that we could find out about. We located them for the case studies. What are their durations? Do they happen on weekends? Do they happen for a month? Do they happen only on Sundays? So you begin to understand the rhythm. Then we actually made drawings to scale of how the markets are made, how they're dismantled, so that one can actually draw this into the debates of architecture using that very language. And how in this case the train comes, so the market has to be collapsible so the train can sort of pass. And so Richard Sennett, who is a famous sociologist, did the preface for this, and what he said is this project is an exploration of a reality which at once very old and entirely new. Human settlements have always included temporary settlements like the camp of an army which appears and disappears in a few days, or the mobile tents and households, possessions of hunter-gatherers at the very dawn of human social life. The common assumption about civilization that in time stone should come to replace fabric, that human settlement should become even more solid in material and structure the longer they endure. Today we can no longer make that assumption. And he's almost asking and challenging that as what he was inspired in seeing this presentation. And the part that is due to be mobile, so he said mobile phones and other advanced technologies in which the pixel comes to replace stone. Cities are being reshaped around the notions of communicative space rather than fixed physical form. As well as this, the city is becoming less fixed in ways that remain physical in nature. And so this was, he kind of made the provocation that we should actually extend this more mindfully. And so the Kumbh Mela project, which Ashokji asked me to talk about, so I've included it, so please bear with me for those of you who heard it many, many times. I know Katie has and many other people, was one project that was interesting for many reasons. It was interesting because it was an interdisciplinary project, and it was such an out-of-box idea that we said we're going to map an ephemeral megacity that it disarmed every discipline. So whether it was public health, design, engineering, divinity, everyone was equally challenged that they spoke to each other and they didn't go by assumptions. And we began to study this, and these images are something you all are all familiar with. But it was between 7 schools within the university, so it was unique for that reason. And of course the Kumbh, as you know, it emerges from the watery sort of rivers, the confluence, and when the sandbanks become visible, you begin to have a terrain. So which means there's very little time, and in October is when you even know what the site of the Kumbh Mela is, which is an interesting idea. It's the ultimate in this kind of ephemeral urbanism, and that's an image I took when I went there in September, and that's from the same spot. That tree is the same tree, and a whole city emerges. Now, it's called a pop-up city, which is a completely wrong definition. It's a very mindful city, which is planned over the 9 months before it happens, so it's not pop-up, and it has a very, very particular logic. And what was very interesting was before Google Street Maps and things, we put pro cameras on vehicles, got permission, and actually mapped all the streets. So this is in the archive, and that is Dinesh Mehta. They didn't give us permission for helicopter, they didn't give us permission for drones, but we found there was no mention of kite photography. So he mounted his cameras on that kite, and we mapped the whole, so all the images you'll see are from that kite, which was incredible. The mistake we made is we got there on Makar Sankranti, which is the day the Mela opens, and we went with our big kite and flew it, and about 40 kites came and chopped us down, all the kids in the area. So then we had to give many kids 100 rupee notes each to retrieve our kite and the camera. So it was an interesting experience, but Dinesh did an amazing job. And these are city images that he took from the kite, where you begin to see the grid, you see the expansiveness of the city, etc. And we went into the archives, and this is something I've not shared before, but this is very interesting because this is from the 50s where photographers weren't even allowed there. And I think one of the early books that came out in the 70s, I believe, was Raghuveer Singh, who did a small book on the Kumbh Mela, which I had seen when that was my first introduction to the Kumbh Mela, and these from the archives we found they didn't allow photography, or people had done these large overviews. It was very chaotic, and the British then finally set up systems in the late 1800s. They began to set up systems to contain this chaos, because they must have thought there was a revolution. And so it was very frugal. People came with little potlis. Everything was made in thatch. These are images from the archives. But you see on the landscape, it's completely chaotic. And the image I showed you was a perfect grid. And so I think they started using town planning. Then when Chandigarh happened, they started using the grid, because the IS officers in charge are usually deputed from the Urban Development Ministry. And so these are the kinds of plans that evolved over time. But what was mind-blowing was when we studied this, this was the only one document by which the whole Mela operated. It was all an oral tradition that the IS officers would call others, give them positions, and all of this kind of thing. And it just happened. And so we were stunned at the lack of information we got. We found things like this where they had rationalized the bathing, because there used to be bloodbaths between the akhadas of who goes in first. And they rationalized the times and which akhada could go. They started mapping diseases. So these are all in the Allahabad University Library, these archives. And they are fascinating. No one has really worked on it. And we didn't have the time because we did this at very short notice. But we also set up a conference tent there, and we did discussions. We invited people while we were at the Kumbh Mela. So it was like a little university outpost, which was very interesting. But I'll just share with you very quickly a few observations. It's a perfect grid that they employ on it. So if the river shifts, the grid works. But what makes the grid work is every street, as you can see in that image, goes across as a pontoon bridge. And so it's very robust. Otherwise big cities across a river have two bridges and you have traffic jam, one breaks down and finished. But every street goes on. That's what makes it so efficient. That is the efficiency, where the grid appears irrespective of the river, in a sense. So the mobility is fantastic. So we actually made drawings sitting with the fabricators of the bridges, how they were made. We understood sanitation. We mapped where the toilets were. We looked at the metrics. It's like it replicates an existing city of 5 to 7 million people who live there. I say this in public, that all the figures that you hear about people, how many people visited, are completely unbelievable. But anyway, it is 30 million at the peak, etc., which were done by the business school at the university using cell phone data, aggregated cell phone data. So even if that was off, they came up with numbers of 60 and 70 million, not the 200 and 300 you're hearing now. And of course, we looked at security systems and how they operated and all of that, the langars. This is wonderful. What you see that is, it asks you, have you washed your hands with Lifebuoy soap? And they had a print of a heating lamp which left that impression. So there was subtle advertising because and this is the process. The terrain becomes available, they flatten it, they put up all the infrastructure, they put up all the light, they put up the toilets. These are the only things that they go below the ground, nothing else goes under the ground. And they pass out the land between the akhadas, so you get a grid. They do a little puja, and then they begin constructing the city. And the city gets constructed with many, many actors, and it goes on. And what you get is this incredibly gridded city with the diversity, but the grid holding it together. What is remarkable is this entire city that is above the ground is made out of 5 materials. It's 8-foot-tall bamboo, rope and string, nails, and a skinning material. And it all comes together and aggregates. But through this variety, so the biggest temple also uses just those 5 materials. The single family tent also uses. So it's actually a systems approach by default, which has evolved over the years. But it's worth recognizing that, because it allows us to then think differently about theory and about how we can deploy things here. So even this, it's just the same materials. Even this, it looks different, but it's the same materials. There is no change or new materials. The other thing, and this is the last thing I'll share, was the administrative structure, which was really mind-blowing because it also works on a temporal scale. So this is a mapping, and we did this in talking to the administrators. The different colors tell you who is administrating. The red is the chief minister, the politician, the yellow is the administrators, and the blue is where the Mela Adhikari and the divisional commissioner become in charge. And so 6 months before the Mela, it just shifts and the hierarchy changes, and they only report to 1 or 2 people. So you don't get caught in the overall maze of bureaucracy. So think about it. It is, as I'm talking about the ephemeral and the temporal, here the governance system, and if you think about it in our buildings, what stays and persists longer than even the buildings is the governance systems. And now with climate change and emergencies, we can't respond to it because we haven't rethought the governance systems in that sense. And so my point is only this, that I think there is an ecology and there are layers that we have to address simultaneously, otherwise we don't find the solution in architecture. And so this is when the chief minister is in charge, this is when he gets more bureaucrats involved, this is when the bureaucrats take over, this is when the Mela commissioner, who you see Madan Lal Mishra sitting there with his hands under his chin, he takes in charge, and he can report straight to the chief minister, he can go to contractors outside the circle, and he becomes the mayor for 6 months to deliver this thing, this mega event. And this is where he goes outside, that's him, now he's in charge. So it's fantastic how the hierarchies shift on a temporal scale, which is something worth sort of learning from. And then of course on the last day, they pay tribute to the Mother Ganges, the high priest, and the city disappears. And within a week, this was a week later, the mats persist. The farmers use the grid to come in and do 1 crop before the monsoon. They're very inventive. And it's just quite magical. And then, of course, the river comes, leaves no memory. And it is an ephemeral urbanism. It is an ephemeral landscape. But it's not a pop-up city. It's formal, it's intentional, it's deliberate. And if you don't study the systems, you think, oh my God, this is like the earlier ones like chaos. It's like the informal settlements, right? But it's deliberate. So the aesthetic baggage is something that I think as a profession we have to interrogate much more deeply in terms of what it means. And so this is, that image shows all the adhikaris who came to Harvard. We sat with them for 10 days and just asked them questions because there was no record about how this happens. And it was an exercise actually in oral history, and that's how we produced the book. It became an exhibition at the Venice Biennale, which was interesting because Does Permanence Matter was a provocation at the world's biggest architecture biennale, where architecture is the central theme. And this book came out of it, which was Ephemeral Urbanism, Does Permanence Matter, which captured all this, and the taxonomies. And from that came this issue of Marg magazine last October, which some of you attended my talk with Naman, where we said, let's look at tents. And if you think about it, tents are the most persistent emblem of human settlements. And so therefore, what can we learn from tents? And in this issue, we looked at a number of things. We talked about how they were enduring. That's a wonderful Mughal map, which shows how tents, and as Naman pointed out, the person in charge of the city had the status of a general who went in advance to set up the tent. There were hierarchies that came from it, how it was used in the pandemic. But we also had scholars who talked about the materiality of tents, the fabric, the textile, and what that meant, which is of course Naman's expertise. I won't even go into that. The velvet tent, the red velvet tent, but also for refugees, for protests, for the farmers' protests, and how do these get deployed. This is a piece I did on tents as accompaniments to building, because we look at Mughal buildings without the layer of fabric, and actually that expands it. It's what climate responses are modulated through that. And so this has been a persistent, it has to be complementary. It can't again be the temporary and the permanent and the binaries we sit into. And I think we have to embrace architecture to do that, because the lightness, the agility, the adaptability, the notion of the ephemeral gives us many other sorts of possibilities. We looked at the Hajj terminal. These are high-tech tents, but they are tents and they serve incredible functions. Of Shigeru Ban's bamboo tent, of Fry Otto's Munich Olympics. Why are Olympics investing so much in infrastructure? Olympics now should be like the old circus, a traveling show, where the Olympic Committee should own pneumatic structures and tents, and they should go and camp, and they should leave no trace. They leave such big white elephants that are disastrous. And so therefore the ephemeral, I think, as a provocation within the notion of urban planning and architectural imagination, I think is one we have to reclaim. In fact, our theory with these sorts of ideas, the Bedouin tent is mind-blowing in the way it responds to wind, and the people who are experts in setting it up based on climate. It takes its form, and it's no different from Fry Otto's tents. It's logic in terms at a much smaller scale, right? And this is the Munich Olympics. And ordinary trends of markets, this is it's a market in Bangladesh, and just look at, these are drone images, it's like fabric almost, which occurs on weekends and things. And the last one was this concrete tent, which is something I was very moved by. I happened to go to the Sharjah Biennale, and it's a tent that Dar, who is an artistic practice, did. It's a concrete tent, which they've done in the middle of the desert, and it's an architectural preservation project, which is understood not as an instrument of permanency. Sorry, it's in the village of Al Madam in outside Sharjah. It's about an hour's drive from there, and it was a colony which got overtaken by the sand dunes, and this artistic group did this concrete tent, and it's a hybrid between a tent and the modern house, because it's in concrete. It's this provocation about where do we stand, and it's an art installation, and it's meant to highlight the paradox of the binaries of the soft and the hard, the temporary and the permanent, movement and stillness, dislocation and relocation. And in their words, the artists, they say, permanent temporariness is a condition of dislocation and relocation caused by political, economic and environmental conditions depriving people to act and engage with the present, either stuck in a nostalgia of a lost past or an idealized future. The present seems inaccessible for most people who face this dislocation, like many migrants that we are seeing. So it's a preservation project which is understood not as an instrument of permanency, but a method of re-narrating this intervention as a permanent temporariness in a heritage city. And so this is a very interesting project which sort of raises some of these sort of questions, and that's how it sits in the desert. And what's also quite moving is when you go into it, you hear a recording of the names of the children killed in the war that are just repeated, thousands of them. And it's a very, very moving experience to be part of this installation. And the research questions, one was working on ephemeral urbanism, and when one was working on the Kumbh, the kind of positive feedback, going back to propositional research, was this is a religious festival, what does it mean for urbanism? That forced us to expand and create the taxonomies that began to construct the rubric of ephemeral urbanism. And then the criticism was, what has this got to do with architecture? Which was good, because it took us to the emblem of the tent. And therefore the research questions that are coming up from this is the notion of uncertainty, and how do we deal with uncertainty on a temporal scale, and how do we look at the life cycle of materials? Because in any building, there are 20 materials with different life cycles, and good conservation architects recognize that, because the problems lie at the intersection of two materials where the life cycles are different. And that tells us that embedded temporality, how do we embed temporality, the notion of time, in our disciplinary thinking, and how do we theorize permanence and temporality for the idea of the home? Because in the home, permanence is what you always cling to. But I don't have the answers, but these are, for me, the questions I like to share with the community. And so the illusion of permanence also matters. So now that I've talked about impermanence, I want to talk about permanence. And a lot of my work on Mumbai was really founded on conservation, saving historic buildings. It was really about permanence, and now I reflect on it and think what would be that place. And we got involved in getting the regulations through. It was the first heritage regulations. It was all about permanence, right? But actually the question we were asking, this is a designation by the government, the question we were really asking was not getting stuck, and I can say this more clearly in retrospect, but I was completely battered by criticism at that point, was that it is not about discerning significance as much about constructing significance for the future. It makes the task of the architect harder, because we are committed to creating the illusion, conserving the illusion of the architecture, but draining places of their symbolic and ideological content. And so for me, this image of these two guys gazing at all these British statues that were displaced in Mumbai brings to the fore that when the creators of an environment are different from the custodians of the environment, it is contingent on the custodians to construct new narratives to appropriate that heritage while keeping its physical integrity intact. And that's a much more complex question, which brings in notions of temporality in time, meaning, permanence, temporary, etc. And I think that's what led us to reinvent or construct significances like the Kala Ghoda area. It was never an art festival, but we felt that was the contemporary engine that could drive drive conservation, or the banking district, or etc. And this is a lecture in itself, as you know. And so a lot of this came out of that thinking, where we were committed to creating the illusion of architecture intact, but actually creating new ideological or new reuse meanings for it. And whether it was about the integrity. Abha Narayan did this, where I was a client because I was part of the Kalagura Association, but it was about also creating the integrity, keeping the integrity of buildings. And the last section, I'll just touch upon architecture. And what has happened in India is now our identity is constructed by the process of arriving, not at the destination. The destination is chaos and our freeways, and in Mumbai, everyone's so proud of the seaway and etc. So it's infrastructure that is defining. It's a process of arrival, not the moment of arrival any longer. And so the books and the work I did, Architecture in India since 1990, was an attempt at that time when we were liberalizing our economy to make sense of what was happening in architecture. So architecture is also an interest, and so I want to just clarify the tense and all of that is okay, but it's a question of how you find a balance. And we came up with this sort of taxonomy, so to speak, of global practices, which is when people were sending email drawings, you got glass stars everywhere, regional manifestations, which are local assertions, all the great architects, Charles Correa, Doshi, Raj Rewal, others who were trying to bring this kind of dissolve this binary between what might be local and what might, and then of course alternate practices, Laurie Baker, Revati Kamath, many others, and then counter-modernism, which was really the resurfacing of ancient imagery, Akshardham and all of that. So it was a documentation, and one did this quite intuitively, partly because I was very interested in the idea of the models of practice, by which how do you construct a model of practice, and the argument was that by framing a practice in a way, you result in a particular set of images. So can we simultaneously engage with different models? And one did it because my own practice started in 1990, so in a way I was reflecting on 20 years of my own practice. And I'll never forget, Professor Menon is here, and he said something when I presented this at the Max Muller Bhavan. He said, what you by default have done, which is very difficult, is write a contemporary history. That made me very conscious of what one had done, and then one also found many flaws in the observations because they were not sometimes historically as accurate. But that got translated into an exhibition with Ranjit and Kaivan, Ranjit Hoskote and Kaivan, where we looked at many, many aspects. And I want to point out one thing that came out of the research, which was that, I'm sorry, this is very dim, but you see a line going up right at the top, and you see a stack of names that are piling up, right? Now, what the names of things stacking up are the growth of schools of architecture. And the graph above it is the growth of real estate since 1990. And it's interesting that once real estate was accepted as a formal sector, the schools of architecture jumped up. What we found from this research is actually the organization and growth of research, or the growth of schools should be inversely proportionate to the growth of real estate, not directly. Because when a developer does a gated community, which is 500 families, they employ one in-house architect. Whereas if you have 500 families in Defense Colony, there'd be at least 200 or 300 architects. So actually the growth of real estate is the worst thing for the profession, because the growth of schools, that's why schools are closing down, or I don't know what they're doing. I shouldn't be criticizing schools of architecture. But it's this kind of thing that I think makes us much more vigilant, I hope, in terms of discovery of what we might do. And there were many events and conversations which were fantastic. These are catalogs that came out of it. And this is the graph that shows you the growth of real estate from 1990, where you see that blue line jumping up, and the schools of architecture. Because I suppose parents are driving around and a lot of buildings are coming up, and they look at their kids and say, good line to be in, a lot of work, but they don't realize one architect in-house is doing that whole complex, right? And so we also brought in people from South Asia. This was the beginning of a conversation in South Asia. That was the last event of this. And now that is extended, and this is the last thing I'm showing you, on South Asia, where we've got a project that has been going for 3 years, over the pandemic, 4 years, which has had all these components. We had an exhibition and conference in December here in Delhi. A lot of you, I think many of you I see here, were there for some of those. We mapped 41 young practices. Everyone asked me why 41. The only reason for 41 was we didn't want to make it 40 because the publisher would have called it 40 under 40, which was very cheesy. So we made it 41 and threw the publisher for a toss. And so it's called Emergent. It's called Architectures of Transition. There was a questioning. There were many people involved in this, but there were conferences, conversations, and this was the book that captured it. And now there's a book coming out which will capture the conference and the conversations in the conference. But this has been very encouraging because one finds in architects who are in their 40s and below a whole new approach. And many of the things that I've talked about in the earlier part of the lecture, one is now seeing emerging, not because of them having seen my research, I'm only observing, but there are a lot of non-traditional organizational structures. I find in these 40 fund practices, multidisciplinary work, there are cross-subsidies in terms of financial models, the co-curation with communities, there's a lot of cross-disciplinary work. It's amazing and refreshing to see hope in another generation. And I just end with these two diagrams, which is just a graphic I made of all our publications, because research as practice, so the practice has to have some amount of work. And so this has been a mapping where we've now tried to create a taxonomy on what are the writings related to practice, to advocacy, to pedagogy, and to research. And I think, and we have now tried to take the books, and these are the books, and see what themes are emerging from them, like the kinetic city. What those books have captured thematically, which might be, again, as propositional research, useful to think about a theoretical framework. And these are catalogs and things that have been done. And I just want to end with saying that for me, then that's why I could do the next one called Practice as Research, because the multiplicity of modes of engagement that I think should be intrinsic to designers is worth a serious attention as an effective means to address the shifting scenario of flux and the challenges of designing for transitions. I think all of us, and especially the next generation, has to design for transitions. We can't be caught with looking at what are absolute solutions. We don't know what the world will be day after tomorrow. As you know, someone wakes up every day and makes new policies in some other part of the world. And so I think to make ourselves like stable four-legged stools, not one-legged stools or two-legged stools, I think research extending into pedagogy, which many of my mentors implicitly sitting in the audience have already done, is a much more stable way of us engaging with the world, of us embracing advocacy simultaneously to imagine new forms of practice, new questions, which will give us new theoretical frameworks, which is essentially a way of creating a moral compass. And I think that is going to be very critical in a time of flux, and for us to calibrate and bring into balance our spheres of concern with our spheres of influence, it is contingent on us to embark on this. Thank you very much. I'm happy to, but also we can talk outside. Okay. I'm happy to. Or we can meet outside and chat.
Well, friends, I'm forever confused.
They say in today's world, if you're confused, it means you're thinking clearly.
But I must say it was a very brilliant lecture, which confused me. It confused me in the sense that I have never heard someone making such a strong plea for impermanence, such a strong plea for the temporary rather than the. When you think of architecture, you normally think of stability and monuments and visibility and things of that kind. Here is someone who is talking about impermanence, the temporary, the ephemeral. And I think that sounds to me very poetic. So as a poet, I'm enormously pleased. And normally we do not have question-answer session in memorial lectures, but we have some time, I think about 10 minutes. So I don't want anybody to give an opinion. Somebody has to ask a question. Ask the question sharply and briefly. Yes, please. You wait for the mic to come to you.
Amlan is a lawyer and a poet, so he'll do both your things.
My name is Amlan Goswami from the Indian Institute for
Hold the mic a little closer.
My sharp, pointed question is, thanks for everything. The question is, how hopeful are you of impatient capital and the powers of corridor in, if not embracing this idea of impermanence, but at least acknowledging it and manifesting it in some of the plans, policies, the fine print, as it were?
Well, not hopeful at all, because it's contradictory to, the impatience of capital. Capital has to land, and terrains that don't give it any friction, it realizes its value. Well, even if it lies empty, because we know sometimes it's illegal money becoming legal through buildings, right? So that's maybe the way to stop it is us organizing different imaginaries, and I think resistance is building, and I see it building within the profession now. That's why the profession has to have agency, has to have a voice, and which means I think we have to be part of the broader conversations. Look at what's that discussion on iconic buildings in Mumbai. It was such a ridiculous discussion, and I found very little, actually. The sharpest comments about it was made by a spokesperson of the NCP, not an architect, right? And there were architects babbling around. I'm sorry if I've offended anyone there, but we are not part of that conversation. I mean, they should be reaching out to someone to head a commission to discuss what the form of the city should be, and we don't have that within our, whether now that's the role of academia, whether it's the role of us as civil society, as architects, in fact. And civil society, I believe, is going to be our biggest patron in the future. It's not going to be the state or the private, because they have merged their aspirations, right? And that's why we all know the political powers and real estate is one. Land is made urban, so it can be bought in advance. So now our only hope is civil society, and civil society in its most robust definition would be people who, like many people, all of us here actually, have the ability to be empathetic to the grassroots, the poor, but also have the wherewithal to negotiate more powerful forces, right? Labor unions, which got a bad name, are actually a classic example of civil society, right? It was bad name because it came in the way of business and all of that. So we have to find those equivalents, and I think our alignment as planners and architects and everything should really be with civil society.
Thank you. I agree with Ashok Bajpayee that it was a very brilliant lecture. I have heard you many times. My name is J.K. Jain. I have just one question about the contradiction or paradox between the permanence and the temporary. Recently we heard, and I read some newspaper comments about this corporatization and delivery model, providers model for slum resettlement, Dharavi for example, or maybe these new secretariat buildings in central eastern New Delhi, and whether these are contradictory and we are not keeping pace with the new developments where the cars should not be allowed in these areas of high security zone like Central Vista, and we are creating more permanent parking, 3 basements, 4 basements. So what is your view about that?
So I would say that I'll take you to 2 parts. So I'll take the slums, which is a big thing. And I think that's where Charles's ideas are of relevance again. I don't think the solutions of Dharavi lie in Dharavi, they lie in how New Bombay could have been developed, right? So again, we have to, the tripartite of a successful city of 4 parts is livelihoods, mobility, and dwelling. I'm not even saying housing, right? And the relationship between those 3, amenities supported, right? Which is what New Bombay was based on. And so Dharavi is being redeveloped. It's a real estate project, right? I think from my understanding, 40% of the slum dwellers, if they are housed there, they would be lucky, right? They're going to be displaced. So that conversation should happen in the context of the metro area, not site-specific, which is where urban design can play a role. As far as Delhi goes, I don't know, you all know it better, so my only reaction was when it happened, I thought it was a good opportunity to make one more Delhi somewhere else, the 8th Delhi or the 9th Delhi, instead of, yeah.
Yes.
Sena, I'm a physicist and an IT professor.
Hi.
You know, I agree with Vajpayee that it has been quite a mind-blowing lecture and it changed a lot of concepts. I have a very simple question about the smart cities and the artificial intelligence which is now going to make inroad into architecture.
Smart cities.
Yeah. So what is your take on smart cities? Whether you treat it as traditional or whether you will treat it as permanent, and whether you approve of the idea. Because in South Korea I saw some of the smart city designs are beautiful and it is making life very comfortable. Thank you.
That's again a long response, but I'll respond in 2 or 3 parts. You know, there was a famous urbanist, Michael Sorkin, who died unfortunately in the early part of the pandemic. And he was putting together a book with inviting people from around the world to write, and he was a friend, and the book was titled Stupid Cities, which was a take on smart cities, right? And the reason he did that was that, which is what I'm going to explain. So I'll take the case of India. Well, I don't want to go into a lecture of smart cities, but it's really the nexus of technology trying to push something. But if you think about it, smart cities are where domains are networked, right? Domains of mobility, water, they're networked, right? But if you don't have the domains, which means that infrastructure doesn't exist, what do you actually network? So it's actually an oxymoron in my view, right? I feel, and I say this in Delhi with some care, is I believe the JNRUM more accurately described what our cities needed, rather than this leap to smart cities. Now, it was symbolically maybe a thing for a new government to make the thing, but it, I think, hasn't. And I will say this confidently because I had a student of mine, an urban design student, an Indian student who now works in the US. Her thesis was on smart cities. She did something wonderful, which is she looked online at the 100 smart cities and she got access to the tender documents for all the projects in the smart cities. 75% of those projects were beautification projects, from fountains to paving to stuff like that. So that is the urban renewal, right? It wasn't about networking domains. So I think we have to reinvent a rubric, and that part of my provocation here is let's look at the issues we face and what is the rubric we construct. Smart cities is a tired rubric which comes and is driven by vested interests that want to push technology.
Very brief question, and may I just echo what Ashokji said? Totally brilliant and mind-blowing lecture that you have delivered. And much to think about. We wait for the book. The question is, in my humble opinion, with so many architects here, I think urban planning has to be at the core. And I want you to answer how we can achieve better urban planned cities rather than the architecture of individual buildings or individual sort of housing plans.
Yeah, so I mean, the reality is that planning has become, it's become rearguard action in India, right? Planning is supposed to be avant-garde, and I think New Bombay and some of these were the last gestures of avant-garde planning, where planning was leading the imaginary of what the city could be. Now it's rearguard action. We very nicely identify and articulate a problem and then try to act, whether it's our metros, whether it's all of that. It's like intense bypass surgery, right? Versus changing lifestyle, for a heart patient analogy, right? So I think that's one problem. The second is, I think our major cities, I believe, have become black holes of intellectual and financial capital. Everyone is here, so we are doing more. The small towns don't even have the wherewithal, the capacity to write an application for infrastructure. Because like I showed you, those 13,000 places don't even have a planner sitting there, not that we have planners here, right? So the second problem is we are locked. Look, all of us have the capacity, don't go away from the big towns because of lifestyle questions. You might get a job in some small place and go and come back for the day, right? So young people are also doing the same. You remember in medicine, you had to graduate, go to a rural posting for 6 months, and you were exposed to a range of diseases that would equip you to think about the problem differently. We should do that for internships. So instead of in the schools, I believe instead of allowing people to just find internship in all the big offices in Bombay, Delhi, which just keep rejecting them and poor people get no internships, the IIA, the Council of Architecture, the schools of architecture should set up fantastic YMCAs in small towns with good internet, safe water and good food, accommodate 50, 60 people. They should do internships in these places which the profession should subsidize. They'll make allies there, they'll go back and practice there, they'll learn so much. So our sites and our intellectual and financial capital is being, they're looking, you know, that whole analogy of someone looking for a lost key under a lamppost, and someone says, why are you looking for the key here? You parked there. They said, no, there's light here, so I'm looking for it here. It's what's happening in urban planning. And the third would be that urban design, which my friend here, Katie, has been really vociferous about, is missing. It's a bridge practice. So planning has become very abstract. The babus sit and make policy documents and money is deployed. And architects are told, leave 3 meters here, 4 meters there, you can go up to 10 floors, and they build a building. There's no fabric left, right? Urban design, I think, has to be really ramped up here. It's been the missing piece for a long time, since independence almost.
So is there a solution to this? Otherwise, India is sunk.
No, the solution is as civil societies, let's salvage what we can salvage. Let's not just keep going on about our big, great cities. Let's abandon our cities intellectually for a while and focus on the sites that could make a new India, in a sense, where land is less contested, the contestations in terms of the nexus are less complex, and where we can really make a change. And that's for civil society, not only for planners and architects.
Well, friends, we come to the end because we have time constraints. No, thank you. You raised your hand rather belatedly. So thank you, Rahul, for a brilliant lecture. Thanks for the invitation. Thank you. And thank you all for being here. We run a series here called Architecture Matters, in which we had a series of conversations, panel discussions, and we hope you'll be able to come to them. Delhi may not believe that architecture matters, or perhaps matters anymore, but we here do believe that architecture matters, and since you are interested in architecture, you matter. So please do come. You will come to know. What is the date?
25th September.
25th September. And we are going to talk, hopefully, not we, the panelists, going to talk about music and architecture. We have had cinema and architecture, we had dance and architecture, and we had literature and architecture? No, not yet. Theatre and architecture, and we'll have music and architecture. So please do come, especially the younger crowd. Thank you very much.